Welcome to another episode of The Artsy Raven, a show about writing and publishing with your host, J.F. Garrard.
Welcome to another episode of the Artsy Raven. Today, our special guest is K.R. Wilson. So, K.R. Wilson is a Toronto area writer. His novel, An Idea About My Dead Uncle, won the inaugural Guernica Prize in 2018, and his novel, Call Me Stan, was longlisted for the 2022 Leacock Medal. His follow-up novel, Stand on Guard, will be published by Guernica Editions in 2026, and his sci-fi noir, Tendrils, by Palimpsest Press in 2027. His work has appeared in various literary journals and the flash fiction anthologies This Will Only Take a Minute and Sticks and Stones. And he can be found at krwilson.ca. We'll have the links down in our notes and on social media at KRW Books. So, welcome, Kevin.
Thank you. Very glad to be here.
Now, tell me a little bit about yourself and how you started writing.
Well, I've always written, even when I was a kid. At a certain point when I was approaching 30, I decided, you know what, I've always wanted to write a novel, and if I don't do it now, when will I ever do it? So I wrote a novel, which mercifully has never seen the light of day. And then sometime after that, my wife and I had made arrangements to travel to China to adopt our daughter, and I did a lot of research into Chinese history and culture, and took a lot of notes and a lot of video while we were there, with the idea that that material might be useful for a novel that I'd already sort of started conceiving of. That ended up becoming my novel, An Idea About My Dead Uncle. Then a friend of mine pointed out to me that Guernica Editions was starting this contest, the Guernica Prize for Unpublished Manuscript, and maybe I would want to consider submitting to that. So I submitted it, and I also submitted the manuscript for Call Me Stan, which I had written by then. Dead Uncle made it through to the semifinals, to my surprise, and then to the finals, to my surprise, and ultimately was successful. And so the prize, I mean, there was a cash prize, but more importantly, the prize was publication.
Mhm.
So almost out of nowhere, I was a published author, having written on and off for most of my life.
Okay, cool. Now, what is your background? Like, are you
I did an
uh,
undergraduate degree in music with a major in
okay?
composition.
Okay.
Um, that doesn't make me a very good composer, but
What?
what it did do that I think has been useful to me later in life is it uh, it provided me with a sense of form and structure that I think has probably found its way into my writing. Uh, After that, I went to law school. I
Mhm.
was a federal crown prosecutor for more than 30 years. Around the time I retired, about 5 years ago, Guernica published Call Me Stan, and I already had some ideas for the new novel, Stand on Guard, at that point, and retiring gave me much more time to focus on writing. So since that point, uh, uh, Call Me Stan came out 5 years ago. Stand on Guard came out earlier this month. Um, Tendrils, which I'd written in the meantime, was picked up by Palimpsest and will come out in 2027, as you noted in the intro. I have a sequel to Tendrils that's out for consideration right now, and I'm working on a third book about Stan called Stand By Me.
Like, it seems like everything's happening at the same time in a way. So,
Well, that's a huge advantage to being retired.
Oh, yeah, yeah, why not? Okay. Now, what are some of the biggest influences on you as a writer?
It Music is always huge in my writing because of my background, my undergrad degree in music. Uh, an idea about my dead uncle, the narrator, is a young composer who ends up traveling to China to see if he can find his mother's cousin who went back to China from Canada in the 1970s and ultimately disappeared. So a lot of the narrator's background as a composer came from my own experience. Um, in Call Me Stan, the narrator, who is a 3,200-year-old Hittite immortal, has three things in his life that he does fairly routinely over and over: singing, soldiering, and uh, and meditating, basically. So sometimes he's in choirs, sometimes he's in military forces, sometimes he's in monasteries. But the the music parts of what he does very much come again just from my having been so immersed in music and music history over much of my life.
Yeah, I mean, a long time ago, I took music history and composition class at the RCM downtown in Toronto. So I remember there was always a structure, but I can never hear the music. I am not gifted. I can follow the rules, but like I cannot hear what I wrote in my head, unlike, some other people that had perfect pitch and stuff like that. Now, do you find some of that skills, I guess, transfers into writing from music composition? Like, because you're sort of creating something there too.
Yeah, I think so. I I think I've developed a sense of how to bring back a phrase to unify a section. Doing that with a turn of phrase in writing is functionally the same skill as bringing back a phrase of music that harkens back to something that came before.
Okay. Now, your latest book, Stand on Guard, can you tell us like the back cover synopsis of what the story's about?
Yeah, it's a sequel to Call Me Stan. So Call Me Stan, there's a I'll try not to dwell on it too much because we're here to talk about the new book. But Call Me Stan, as I said, the narrator is a 3,200-year-old Hittite immortal. He can die, he just hasn't yet. He doesn't get sick, he doesn't succumb to poisons. But if you cut his head off, he'd certainly die. He there's a there's a present day arc in that one with long digressions into periods of history that he is recounting that he lived through, or at least that he tells us he lived through. Um, Toward the end of that book, he ends up with a nemesis, and that nemesis is a Trojan princess, also immortal, named Troon. The new book gets a little bit meta in that the inciting event for the new book is the fact that the first book got published. Because at the end of the first book, his nemesis thinks she's killed him. But now he has to be worried that she'll read the old book and realize that he's not dead. And so we end up with a kind of a cat and mouse present day narrative between the two of them. Each of them is a narrator in alternating sections of the book, and also, similarly to the first book, long historical digressions into various historical periods that the two of them are telling us about.
Okay. Now, did you find it challenging? Was there any challenging aspects on writing such a book? Like you're switching POVs and you have history in it, but was there anything,
Yeah, the changing points of view,
yeah.
the the thing I had to be most aware of was to make the voices distinct. Um, Stan is very wry, very cynical. He comments on the history in a very anachronistic way. So it's very easy to make his voice funny. Troon, his nemesis, is very serious, very straightforward. So, and and kind of relentless. So one thing I needed not to do was give her that same kind of wry, anachronistic voice. But this is still largely comic fiction. I mean, it's it's serious,
Mhm.
but it has a comic aspect to it. So I had to try to find a way to retain some of the humor in Troan's sections without making her voice the kind of humorous voice that Stan has. Um, and I've had some feedback from people to suggest that I managed to do that. So I'm glad that I succeeded because it took a lot of effort to try to do that.
Now, are there any themes or questions you hope readers take away from reading Stan's story?
I think part of the fun of writing Stan is to try to make historical fiction more relatable because he can comment on it as a modern, from his modern perspective. He's he's talking about these events, I hope, in a way that makes them more accessible to a reader than more straightforward history-based historical fiction might. I also largely place him on the outside of events. He's certainly never the main figure. Um, he's commenting from outside, as an outsider, and I think that lets me take a maybe a little more oblique look or a less deferential look at historical events than you might get in some historical fiction.
Now, when you were doing research, was there one particular historical event that was your favorite?
Um, I've said in other forums that the way I choose the historical events in the books is something catches my fancy, like it's a
Mhm.
shiny thing. I take an interest in that particular point in history, and I immerse myself in it. So I think each one I I feel very drawn to as I'm writing or as I'm reading, as I'm doing the research about it, largely because that's how I got there because it intrigued me. In Stand on Guard, for example, I didn't know until comparatively recently that, well, we all know about the Crusades in the Middle East. Um, I didn't know that there were crusades, same kind of crusades, backed by the Vatican through Northern Europe into what is now Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. You know, nobles and soldiers from European countries took their forces there to combat pagan heresies as they saw them, and the Vatican absolved them from their sins for doing that, just the same way they did when they were in the Middle East. But part of what makes something a shiny thing for me sometimes is I don't think that's very well known to the general public. Certainly not very well known to me. What can I do with that? So I immersed myself in that whole period. It Those crusades went on over 200 or 300 years, and I just immersed myself in all of that until I found the spot where, in this case, Troan is the narrator, where Troan could fit into that narrative. That brought it all down to a very specific couple of years. And at that point, the rest gives me context in my own mind, but it drops away from the narrative unless I need to draw on bits and pieces to flesh out other people's past experiences. Because I'm not writing history, I'm writing fiction.
Yeah,
So
it's fiction. Yeah.
once I have my characters through line in that period, then that's the focus. And I try to stay as close to the historical record as I can, but because I'm a writer of fiction, uh, one of my overarching touchstones is tie goes to the narrative. If I have to play a little fast and loose with some of the historical record because that's what the narrative calls for, then that's what I do.
Now, you mentioned you were a retired Crown prosecutor.
Yeah.
Like, what kind of stuff did you deal with? Like, does any of that make it into the books or anything?
It doesn't really.
Yeah.
I was like a courtroom lawyer prosecuting criminal offenses because it was with the federal crown. It was largely drug offenses. That's what the federal crown mostly does. Uh, but I very consciously did not want just to move from law practice to writing things like legal thrillers. You know,
Yeah,
I just,
that's what I was my first thought, legal thrillers, but yes.
I mean, I, I'm not saying I won't ever do that, but that's just not the sort of fiction that I feel drawn toward doing.
Mhm.
Um, I mentioned earlier I have a sequel to Tendrils that's out being considered. There are some short and very discrete courtroom scenes in that one that draw on my legal experience, but the narrative isn't about the law or what.
Yeah. And now, do you have any advice for emerging authors or new writers? Like, do you have some habits that you think helped you with your writing?
I think one point I would probably like to make to aspiring authors or new authors is savor the editing process. And my wife was a high school English teacher for many years, and she often uh, characterized the various stages of drafting a piece to her students as the first draft is just getting the clay on the table. And then you shape it from there. And that kind of approach has really been central to me. You sometimes see writers say, oh, you know, I love to write, but I just hate the editing process. That's not how I see it. The editing process is the writing. It's the it's where you take what was maybe a not entirely clear or coherent idea and you shape it until it snaps into place. You know, so that's what I would say is savor that process.
So, Kevin, you're going to do a reading for us. Can you give us a little bit of context and then you can start reading?
Yeah, I'll read the opening of the book because it really sets the table with the two narrators, Stan and Troan. And then I think I will probably do a fairly short uh, passage with Troan as the narrator from the section I was talking about earlier with the Northern Crusades.
Okay, sure.
Stan. I have a bone to pick with K.R. Wilson. I've always been careful about who I trust with my story. When a police stenographer transcribed it a few years ago, I wasn't concerned. It was never going to be a public document. Until it was. Imagine my surprise. Somehow this guy got his hands on it, cleaned out the ums and ers and phonetic spellings and awkward repetitions you always find in transcripts, cut out everything the interviewing cop said, and published the result as fiction. Which would have been fine on its own. I don't need credit for my prose. I have to assume it's better than this Wilson character's. And I certainly don't need the money. Whatever he made from it will be trifling next to the hourly interest on my sheltered Caribbean accounts. The problem is Troan. I have to assume Troan has read it. And if she has, she knows I'm still alive. Troan. Imagine my surprise. I thought I'd killed him, Ishtanu of the Hatti. I shot him in the heart. Watched the light leaving his eyes. Now I know I failed. He was stupid to tell his story. You only tell someone you can trust. The police he told his story to could not be trusted. I won't fail when I find him again. So now we'll pick up with Troan. She's in a part of what is now Russia called Novgorod. This is in the 14th century. It's a trading port where she has acquired a Lithuanian slave named Zelva, and kind of on the spur of the moment, she's decided to go to Lithuania with this enslaved woman. Zelva didn't ask why we were going to Lithuania. Maybe she was afraid to. If she had, I'm not sure what I would have told her. All I knew was that I wasn't going back to the Khanate. I could have stayed in Novgorod, I suppose. Trading towns always need translators. But it was also in the grip of the Khan, however loosely, and autocrats don't tend to be happy about people leaving them. Or maybe I was just enjoying flexing a new language muscle and wanted to continue. Whatever the reason, it was a sudden decision. I followed my instincts. They tend to be reliable. From Riga, another Hansa ship took us along the Livonian coast to the river Nieman, and eventually to a town called Vilnius. Zelva was in awe. I've never been to the city. I restrained a smile. I'd been to Alexandria and Constantinople and Athens. Vilnius was barely a town. Yes, it had a stone defensive wall and a castle of sorts and the beginnings of a decent market square. But when you've gazed up at the Temple of Athena in the moonlight, or the golden mosaics under the dome of Hagia Sophia, it's hard to be impressed by a wooden fort on a hill, no matter how big and sturdy it is. The ship turned in along a tributary and eased into place at a pier. "We're here," the captain said sharply. "Off you get." "In a moment," I said. "How much for one of the swords in your hold?" His face froze, just for a moment. "I don't have any swords. There's a papal embargo on supplying weapons to Lithuania." "We can play that game if you like. But your ship is carrying 24 Damascus swords, 70 German crossbows, and 2 crates of spurs." I hadn't wasted my time at sea. I... Sweat broke out across the man's forehead. "Relax. I'm not an agent of Rome. I'm just someone who needs a sword." He took his time responding, considering the options, I suppose. But I had better things to do with my time. "Of course I could become an agent of Rome, if someone gave me reason to." He gave me a good price. He even threw in a scabbard. "You can't just walk up to the castle," Zelva said, shuffling nervously along the dirt track beside me. "Of course not. We have to get inside the wall first." "But you can't just do that either." "Can't I?" We approached a heavy wooden door in the castle's enclosure. 2 guards were playing a dice game by a small fire. They had furs over their shoulders and swords at their sides. They stood to face us. "What's your business?" asked the older of them. I need to speak to your... I turned to Zelva. What's he called again? Her face was pale. The Grand Duke. I turned back to the guards. Your Grand Duke. The younger guard laughed. Sure, we let foreigners in to see the Grand Duke all the time. Foreigners. My Lithuanian wasn't as good as I'd thought. He looked me up and down. What are you, some kind of courtesan, then? I flexed my fingers on the hilt of my sword. Not that I have an issue with courtesans. I've known many fine ones, but I do have an issue with presumption. Then I took a breath and reminded myself that I was here to make friends. Maiming a guard probably wouldn't get me an audience with this Grand Duke. No, I'm an emissary from the Khanate of the Golden Horde. Not strictly true, but close enough, I hoped, to get me up to the castle. Which it did. You come from the Khan? Grand Duke Algirdus looked to be in his 60s, but his eyes were clear and his shoulders broad and strong under his fur cloak. Why shouldn't I just kill you and display your head on a pole at the Podolian frontier? Because no one in wherever Podolia is would know my head if they saw it. How can you not know Podolia? I defeated your Khan's armies there 2 years ago. Are all the Khan's emissaries as stupid as you? I'm not actually an emissary. That was just the simplest way to get to see you. Then why shouldn't I just kill you and display your head over my fireplace? Because I have skills that you can use. What skills are those? I was a translator and interpreter for the Khanate for many years. A great prince like you knows the value of being able to communicate with other great princes, or Khans. And I knew the value of flattery when I needed things from the powerful. I have a whole building full of Franciscan friars to do my communicating. They know Latin and German and Polish and the gods know what else. Do they know Turkic? Never heard of it. What is it? The language of the Khans. I smiled a tiny smile. How can you not know that if you fought their armies at Podolia? Which was a risk, but I did stop short of calling him stupid. He leaned sideways toward a well-dressed stave. Do my monks know this Turkic? I'll find out. He left the room. A few minutes later he was back, accompanied by a middle-aged man in a brown monastic robe. How can I help, sire? The monk said. Do your people know a language called Turkic? The monk hesitated. Well, certainly not as a first language, sire, but I'm sure we could manage if we needed to. Algirdus turned his head to me. Ask him something in Turkic. Do birds ever get confused and lay their eggs on your tonsured head? I asked. He just stared at me awkwardly. That was enough for Algirdus. All right, brother Eilhard. Find a room for... He frowned at me. What was your name again? Dorothea. Find a room for Dorothea in your hospitium. And for my slave. And for her slave. But she's a woman, sire. So is my slave. So is her slave. But make it work. I'll leave it there.
Oh, wow. Are you going to do the audiobook? Okay.
Oh, an audiobook is a huge undertaking.
Yeah, true enough, true enough. Well, thank you very much for spending time with us today.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure.
The Artsy Raven is produced by Dark Helix Press. Introduction voiceover by Chris Gorman. Music by Tim Moore. Please access your bonus content on the Patreon website. Thank you very much for listening, and please stay safe.